Hey, it's time for show and tell. I've always been bothered by the image of the mad scientist. You ever wondered where that comes from? Well, I would put the blame on the doorstep of Mary Shelley, who, of course, in 1818 wrote the classic book Frankenstein. This is not Frankenstein. This is Frankenstein's creation, often referred to as the monster, although not so called in the book. And Frankenstein was not a doctor. Frankenstein was the creator of the creature. He was really an amateur scientist. As a young boy, born in Italy, he had been fascinated by alchemy. He read the works of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus and tried to follow in their footsteps. And then when he went to university in Bavaria, he was taken by chemistry and also by electricity. And Mary Shelley knew about Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta and the invention of the battery, and knew that there were demonstrations being done where corpses were hooked up to electricity and they seemed to come alive. Of course, they didn't. They would just vibrate when an electric shock went through them. Anyway, in the book, Frankenstein is a young student who puts together body parts and in some ambiguous way, maybe with electricity, brings it to life. But it isn't really a horror story. It is more of a story of what can happen when science reaches further than it should reach. What happens when science extends the envelope too far. So that really was the introduction of the mad scientist, even though in the book it's not a mad scientist. But by the time the movie makers got into it, in the era when Boris Karloff played the creation, Victor Frankenstein became a mad scientist. There are other mad scientists, of course, that we know of. There's Professor Frink in The Simpsons, and he's a typical mad scientist. And then we have Beaker in Sesame Street. Again, look at the hair and, the classic image of the mad scientist. But there were other movies besides Frankenstein. There's a 1958 version of The Fly. And I particularly like that film because it takes place in Montreal. And of course, it also deals with chemistry and the so-called mixing of atoms. It's all about a scientist who is experimenting with teleportation and builds a box from where he can transport objects and eventually himself into another such box. And when he attempts to do this, a fly gets into the box, and what happens is his atoms get mixed together with the atoms of the fly, and he comes out as half man, half fly. There's a little problem here with the balance of matter. Fly would have far fewer atoms, of course, than a human being. So how do you become half fly, half human? But, never mind that, because after all, it is science fiction. But there is a scientist playing around with the laws of nature, and again trying to extend the boundaries of science, and it ends up in failure. And then, of course, there are the ducks that are portrayed as mad scientists, and I, of course, have several of them. But you know what? There are real scientists, and sometimes I'm one. Whenever I hear the nonsense from anti-vaxxers, or I hear all about the ridiculous claims made by homeopaths, or I hear about quack cancer remedies, things like coffee enemas and apricot bits, which really amount to snake oil, I become a mad scientist. And that for today is our look at kind of the stuff that I have and show and tell.